We're very pleased today to be sponsoring this gubernatorial forum. The forum is being sponsored today by the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, a collection of 75 cities from across Greater Minnesota who lobby and who advocate for issues important to rural Minnesota communities. Winona has been a long time and good member, and we're here as part of our annual summer conference. I'd also like to thank the Winona County Historical Society for hosting us. And if you didn't take a good look as you were coming in, please take a look at the building that we are in. All of the wood on the ceiling and the floor in the lobby is reclaimed from an 1880s livery stable. And all the stone that's in the lobby and around the elevators is reclaimed from a auto dealership here in town. It is a great example of the kind of progressive, sustainable things that the city of Winona and the folks here do throughout their community. And so please take an opportunity to look at that on your way out. I'd also like to thank Executive Director Mark Peterson and his staff and volunteers for hosting us and helping us put on this great event. I'd also like to thank the city of Winona for all of their help putting this on, especially Myrna Olson, who's one of the great city staff people here. We're very fortunate to have two candidates here for governor. All of the candidates were invited in June, and there was constant contact. We were able to secure Mr. Horner and Senator Dayton right around the time of the primary. Representative Emmer is unable to join us, citing a scheduling conflict. Nonetheless, we are pressing forward because, as I was reminded in a phone call with a reporter down here in Winona, folks down here in Winona take their civics seriously. And indeed they do, as we do throughout Greater Minnesota. And that's the spirit in which we're going to conduct our discussion today. Our moderator for the forum is going to be Pat Lopez, who is a longtime reporter, having held posts in Cincinnati and Los Angeles, as well as a longtime political reporter with the Star Tribune. She is currently their political editor, which means she helps shape and guide their political coverage both at the national and state level. So we're very fortunate to have Pat Lopez today with us. A little bit on the ground rules. We're going to give the candidates 3 minutes for opening statements to introduce themselves and give us a little flavor of why they're running for governor. We're going to ask approximately 10 to 12 questions, and we're limiting each candidate to a 2-minute response. But we are empowering our moderator to drill in, follow up, ask deeper questions if appropriate. And so be prepared, guys. Then we'll be going for a 3-minute closing statement on why Minnesotans should vote for you. J.D. Burton, who's the handsome fella in the salmon tie down here, is our timekeeper. He'll be flashing you the signals of when you've got 30 seconds left and when we'd like you to cease. With that, I'm pleased to bring up Pat Lopez.
I want to thank all of you for coming and the Coalition for inviting me, and also the Historical Society for the use of this beautiful space for this gubernatorial debate. First off, I would like both of you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about why you want to be governor. Why don't we start with Senator Dayton?
Is this the 3-minute portion?
Yes,
of the,
this is your 3-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here today, and walking in, I don't think I've ever had so many people thanking me for coming to an event. I almost hate to start, but I'm very, very glad to be here with you. And the reason I'm running for governor is that I think Minnesota's headed in the wrong direction. You know, I earlier this year traveled to all 87 counties, drove over 9,000 miles. I've held 110 community meetings around the state. And I've heard from many of you, in fact, describing yourselves as Republicans, Independents, Democrats, leaders of your communities, say that the fiscal relationship between the state and local governments has been broken, that you can't trust the commitments that are made, that you budget frugally and responsibly, and then those commitments are broken. Money's taken away unilaterally, and then you're castigated. The governor plenty saying, you know, that you're the ones who have your heads in the clouds and you don't understand the real world when you're spending more frugally than the state government or anyone else. You've been dealing with hard reality all the way through. And you can't provide the essential services, police and fire. I'm very proud to have the endorsement of the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, because they understand, as you do, that their ability to provide those essential services, their protection, to have a partner watching their back as they're going around a dark corner at night, facing who knows what on the other side there, depends upon local government aids, depends upon keeping that financial commitment. Now, I respect Mr. Horner for coming here today, and I was looking forward to having a chance to have hear Representative Emmer explain how it is that his proposal to eliminate local government aids, to transfer that money entirely to the counties, was going to be a benefit to the cities of greater Minnesota. I suspect maybe that's one of the reasons he decided that a fundraiser was more important than meeting here with all of you. Because it is important, it is essential, absolutely essential. And so that is the reason I'm running for governor. I want to restore the trust, I want to restore the fiscal relationship, I want to restore the working relationship between state government and local governments and our citizens, and head this state in a better direction. That's the theme of my campaign, a better Minnesota. A better Minnesota depends on all of you. Continuing to provide essential services depends on the governor to help you do so.
Thank you. Mr. Horner.
Well, thank you very much, and let me echo Senator Dayton. I'm just delighted to be here. It is a great opportunity, and as Senator Dayton said, to be so warmly welcomed is so typical Minnesota and so typical rural communities. So thank you very much. It is a pleasure indeed. You know, I agree with some of what Senator Dayton said. There's no question but that we are at a critical point in Minnesota's future, and I think 2010, this election, really does represent a crossroads, really does represent a choice for Minnesotans in which way we want to go. And there are some difficult challenges, and these are perilous times. But you know, we're also a state of great opportunity, a state of tremendous assets. A lot of what we see in the room, in your communities, reminds us of how great Minnesota really is. And so I'm running for governor, not only to take on those challenges, because I see in this time such great opportunity to move Minnesota forward, to think differently about how we deliver services, how we meet the needs of constituents, how we grow jobs, how we have healthy, vital communities around the state. I started my political career in 1978 with Dave Dernberger on his first campaign for the Senate, and went out to Washington as his chief of staff. And I learned a lot of things from Dave. But one of the things that he felt most strongly about that I've tried to carry over is he always understood that Minnesota is only as strong as its foundation, and its foundation are the communities. And if we don't have healthy communities, if we don't have communities in which people can feel as if they are home for a lifetime, where they can be born there, raise a family there, have great job opportunities, and retire in the same community, then we've lost something as a state. We need to recapture that. And yes, it is a challenge, but it is also our opportunity in 2010. So it is one of the reasons why I asked as my running mate Jim Mulder to join the ticket. I think Jim brings such unique experience, understanding of the relationship between state and local governments, of the opportunities, and also of the challenges. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation with you today with Senator Dayton to talk about how we are going to approach these challenges and how we're going to take advantage of the opportunities. Thank you, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I'd like to get started with what is perhaps the most important topic in this state. There are parts of Minnesota that have had double-digit unemployment for some time now. It's starting to lower overall, but we still have parts of the state where it's enormous. Please tell us what you would do as specifically as possible in the first year of your administration to grow jobs, especially in greater Minnesota. And Mr. Horner, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. Well, it is one of the critical issues, perhaps the critical issue in this election. I've laid out a very specific 5-point plan to revitalize communities around economic development. And I think it really starts by understanding that each of the communities in Minnesota is a little bit different. Each one has unique assets, and we have to leverage those assets. So a couple of things that we need to do. First, we need to make sure that we're allowing our manufacturing base in Minnesota to grow, to compete, to bring on the new technology, new equipment that allows us to create jobs. And so one of the proposals is to eliminate the sales tax on capital equipment and purchases so that these small manufacturers can invest in the new equipment. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're investing in education in all parts of the state and lifelong learning so that we make sure we have strong schools in all of our communities, but that we're also working with our 2-year and 4-year schools to provide lifelong learning, to make sure that those 2-year schools are fully integrated into the economy of the communities so that they are providing the jobs and training skills. Third, we need to invest in research at the University of Minnesota at 2- and 4-year schools so that we're developing the new technologies, the innovation, the new ideas that we then can bring to market in a Minnesota that has a very different tax climate than what it has today.
Mr. Horner, could you get to some of the specifics for the first year?
These are the specifics. This is what I'm going to do in the first year.
Then could you tell us how much you would invest in education? What types of things would you do in that first year?
Well, we're going to invest in education. It is more important to invest in early learning, and so we're coming out with a very specific budget proposal next year. I have said we're going to eliminate the half-cent sales or the sales tax on capital equipment purchases, that we're going to invest in research as a separate line item at the University of Minnesota at our 2- and 4-year schools. We're going to hold higher education at the baseline, that we're going to invest in a bonding bill in the first year to build out the 10-ton roads that we need. I mean, all of those kinds of activities are very specific, and all of them are things that we are going to do in the first year.
Thank you. Senator Dayton.
Well, I'd certainly agree with what Mr. Horner said about education. That's key to our future, from early childhood through K-12 through higher education, and I will make the commitments to repay the shift. One of the euphemisms used to disguise what's really been going on in the real world, if somebody reaches their hand into your pocket and takes out your wallet and says they'll give it back to you when they feel like it, we don't call that a shift. So when that money's owed back to the school, it's actually on the books to be repaid, and that would be a real increase in spending, and I've said I will increase state funding for public education every year I'm governor, with no excuses, no exceptions. In the short term, next year, I would have a bonding bill also in the first year, $1 billion. Look to see if we can go a little higher, depending on interest rates at that point in time, what the financial experts say. Governor Plenty, with his veto last spring, left 400,000 work hours on the table, left men and women who should be working today on the bench, left important projects in places like St. Cloud, Mankato, and elsewhere, civic centers and state university, and even 19 early childhood centers unfunded. I'll put those projects at the top of the list, and we'll also, I promise that Thief River Falls a stoplight at the intersection of Highway 59, where 4,000 workers go to and from Arctic Cat and DigiKey every day. And that's an example of where a governor and a state government should be providing the direct assistance. So you couldn't provide those 4,000 jobs. With how many employers would it take to replace those? So, that's where I will roll up my sleeves and work with you to help the businesses in your communities expand. I propose an energy security savings fund, where we would do what they've done at the University of Minnesota Morris, retrofit state buildings there to make better use of energy efficiencies, retrofit the heating and cooling systems to use alternative energy. In this case, they're buying agricultural residue, corn stalks primarily from local farmers, putting the money in the local economy, investing, pelletizing, gasifying that, saving $1 million a year in energy costs, put that, revolving that fund back into those projects. And finally, highways. Somebody just thanked me for my work on Highway 14. We need to increase our highway construction projects, and that'll put people back to work as well.
Thank you. A quick follow-up for each of you. Mr. Horner, if you would, please tell us where you are on repaying the education shift, and then Senator Dayton, if you would say where you are on elimination of the sales tax on capital equipment.
Well, on repaying the shift, we need to do two things. First is make sure that the state is paying the interest on the loans that have been imposed on school districts so that they're not carrying that burden. And then secondly, lay out a very specific schedule of repaying the school debt. I mean, I appreciate Senator Dayton's commitment to repay that debt in his administration. I'm not sure that he's put the funding toward it, and so that's a bit of a curiosity. I'd like to tell you that we're going to repay it in the first biennium. I don't think it's going to be possible and still maintain the kinds of services that we want in Minnesota in the other areas. So we ought to at least repay school districts and hold them harmless on the interest, and then lay out a firm schedule that we stick to repay the full amount.
Well, the reality, as you know, is we face a projected $6 billion deficit for the next biennium, which includes the assumption of the repayment of $1.7 billion of the $1.9 billion in the school shifts. And so that is factored into my equation. I would like very much to be proposing tax cuts or tax eliminations for various things, and any good economist will point to any tax and say that there's an economic disincentive for something as a result of it. But anyone who proposes reducing or eliminating a tax is going to therefore add to that $6 billion deficit, and needs to be able to tell you in specific dollars and cents terms, focusing at specific functions of government, where that $6 billion deficit, in case of Representative Emmer, who wants to eliminate corporate taxes entirely, $1.7 billion additional, that's a $7.7 billion deficit. Where is that cut going to occur? $6 billion is 16% of the state budget. That's 1 out of every $6 the state is projected to spend in the next biennium. And again, he at least has not told us where that's coming from. So would it be a good idea in terms of economic incentives to reduce or eliminate that capital investment tax? Yes. But again, somebody's going to have to say, where are those dollars going to be made up?
Okay, I'd like to go now to a question about the state's budget deficit. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 billion, could change, could even grow in that time. Both of you have proposed some tax increases to help deal with this. Please tell us what Minnesotans should expect in the way of budget cuts, and please try to be as specific as possible.
Well, Pat, when your editorial board requested of all of the candidates time when we had others running for our proposals, I will say that your editorial board credited Mr. Horner and myself with having the most specific proposals, and mine is detailed on my website, www.markdayton.org, and I proposed $869 million in specific spending cuts. I went through the state budget myself, line item by line item. I identified reducing the outsourcing of private contracting. I think more of that should be done within the state agencies. That's what they exist for, certainly the Department of Transportation. I think the trade office, and I headed that agency where that office resides twice, ought to be eliminated, and the core functions transferred to the governor's office where it can be provided more cost effectively. The State Department of Education conducts 61 different tests of students. I think that's excessive. We'd reduce that. You'd reduce the spending there. Again, they're all detailed there, and I'm going to be restrained by time, but the point, and the other point I want to make is that I went to the Minnesota Chamber this last week, 2 days ago, and sent a letter also to the Minnesota Business Partnership. Spoke to the Minneapolis Chamber this morning, and I would enlist all of you too, asking over the next month for ideas, specific ideas for where we can make further cuts. I have acknowledged that mine's about $670 million short of the $6 billion, the proposal I've made of revenue increases and spending cuts, and so I'm looking for more. And Rudy Perpich had a sign on his office wall, which I'll put back if I'm governor, said none of us are as smart as all of us. And so I welcome ideas, specific suggestions, ones that are going to be in the best interest of Minnesotans and are not going to, again, have serious effects. But the problem we face is that this year's biennial spending state budget is 8% lower than it was 2 years ago. It's not as though we've been expanding and now we need to trim. We've contracted it, and now we're going to face the necessary to contract more, but that makes it an additional challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Horner.
Well, so we're going to do a couple of things, and I'm going to lay all of this out next week in very specific detail, but a lot of it comes in the area of how do we redesign? So how do we change the relationship between the state and county governments, for example, and allow counties to have the opportunity to impose a local option sales tax and then take responsibility for some of the services that now are mandated on them by the state. That's an opportunity for the county government to deliver the services more directly, to hold them accountable. It's an opportunity for the state to redesign the relationship between itself and county governments and to save money while delivering better services. Now, clearly, there are some counties, and look at Traverse County, for example, that's not going to be able to raise the kind of taxes that will allow it to provide services. So we're still going to have a state relationship with some of the counties to make sure that everybody in Minnesota has access to a high level of quality in services. I think we do need to put a freeze on public employees as we enter the new year with the new governor, and to take a look at where there might be savings there. I think what we're going to find is that in some of the supervisory levels of state government, there are opportunities to reduce costs and to save money long term. I think when we look at older adult services, there are going to be opportunities to reduce the role of the state in the institutional care of many older Minnesotans as we start to make a transition to more personal responsibility, more community-based networks. And lastly, just as by way of example, we certainly need to make investments in health care, but do it in a way where we can leverage the federal resources to make sure that we're driving low-cost, higher quality health care throughout Minnesota.
Thank you. As long as we're on the subject of health care, could you please tell us that our current governor has been saying for the better part of 7 years that health care costs are runaway in this state, have to be controlled, will bankrupt everything, swallow up all our other options. Please tell us what your philosophy is on that, and what should we expect on health care? Are cuts unavoidable? Do we need to do the same level of funding, for instance, expectations as education? Is it on that level?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the last part of the question, Pat. So let me talk about the first part of the question.
Most governors have not cut education.
Yeah.
So is health care at that level, and should we just raise taxes to meet that need, or do there need to be actual cuts?
There needs to be a reduction in the cost of health care, without question. But we need to do it in a way that expands services and enhances quality, and we can do it. I do think the governor is right on this point, that the cost of public health programs is unsustainable. But I don't think that you fix that. You don't reform it by throwing people on the street, and when that doesn't work, you don't take the poorest of the poor and throw them onto rural hospitals. That's not going to work. That's only going to further make your jobs that much more difficult as we lose some of those anchors in the rural hospitals. So we do have to reform. Now, the good news is that Minnesota continues to be a leader, and we have done some good things in moving to care coordination. When you have 5% of the population consuming 50% of the cost, there are a lot of good things that are being done with Minnesota companies in which we can better coordinate that care, reduce the cost, and provide better quality care by creating systems where we can keep people out of hospitalization. We can identify the warning signs early enough. I think we do need to move to the Medicaid option, not because it allows us to get the federal dollars in, but because it's going to increase coverage to Minnesotans, and that's an important part of reform. We have to have more people covered throughout Minnesota, including rural Minnesota. We also need to make investments in prevention. We need to hold everybody responsible for their own health and for their own health behaviors, and make sure that we're holding people accountable for good behaviors with incentive, with investments in good public policy, and with investments in direct prevention kinds of programs. And lastly, we need to figure out how we as Minnesotans can leverage the federal health reform. It is not as prescriptive as people think it is. It is a program in which we have an opportunity to define how it's delivered so we get that low-cost, high-quality health care for Minnesota.
Senator Dayton.
I've long believed in a national single-payer healthcare system to get the, particularly insurance company, profiteering out of healthcare. When United Healthcare, the largest health insurance company in the country, reports a quarterly profit of over $1 billion, $1.2 billion to be exact, and by its own accounting, it pays only 81 cents out of every healthcare premium dollar it collects for healthcare. Medicare, which is certainly far from perfect, but it pays 97 cents of every health dollar it collects for health care. That difference between 81 cents on the dollar and 97 cents on the dollar is one of the big reasons why health insurance is unaffordable for so many Minnesotans and why health care is so unaffordable, even for those who have health insurance. I remember a woman in St. Louis Park said, well, she pays $7,000 a year. She's a single woman, mid-50s probably, works for a small employer, the best coverage she can get. She pays $7,000 a year for health insurance, and she still has to pay the first $7,000 for health care. Before that, health insurance pays $1. I mean, that's part of what's fundamentally wrong. Now, Minnesota is not an island unto itself. And Senator John Marty, who's been the leading proponent of the Minnesota plan, has said that he thinks the way to start is to have a study, and I would support that as governor. And let's have a study, and let's certainly look before we leap into anything. Citizens certainly would expect that and should be assured of that. So let's do a study. Colorado did one, actually a subsidiary of United Healthcare did the analysis, and said it'd be cheaper for the state of Colorado to provide a universal coverage through single payer than any of the other options. So let's look at that. We should invest $188 million a net cost to the state with the early opt-in to Medicaid to get $1.4 billion in state money, both to provide better coverage to those 102,000 Minnesotans and also, very importantly, for the rural hospitals, to provide a stable source of funding, a sufficient source of funding so that they can stay in business and provide quality care, so when your constituents get ill and go to the hospitals, they have the best quality medical care as others enjoy at Regions or HCMC.
Thank you. Over the last 7 years, local governments have seen their aid fall by $1 billion. In the wake of that, they have laid off workers, raised property taxes. Please tell us whether you would continue LGA in its current form, and if not, what would you do as an alternative?
Well, I certainly want to hear anyone's alternative because I don't know of one myself. LGA is essential. Local government aids under Governor Plenty's 2 terms have been cut by 50% in real after inflation dollars, and half of that has been made up with property tax increases, and half of that has had to be made up with service cuts. And again, you have been responsible. And you've been penalized and castigated for your fiscal responsibility by others who have not been fiscally responsible. And it's essential that those funds be continued. It's essential that those promises be made. When Mayor Wolden, who was, I believe is here, Mayor Medina, took me around in the aftermath of the devastating tornado there and showed me amazingly with whole blocks flattened that there was no loss of life. I hope I'm quoting you correctly, Mayor. You said, without that you're a poor community, that half of your households have a household net worth of less than $35,000, a third of them less than $15,000. That you couldn't afford to provide these emergency response capabilities, early warning that prevented any loss of life without the assistance of local government aid. And I've heard that all over the state. I've heard from mayors such as the mayor of International Falls who said we relied on the promise by Governor Plenty just before the last election that he would not touch LGA. And then and so we cut our levy by 16%, and then he didn't keep his promise, and so now we've had just to turn around and raise our levy by 17%. Well, that's unfair. And again, for your fiscal responsibility, you should be rewarded with a partnership with the state government. So I will continue LGA. I will continue the funding. I believe there's about a little over $900 million committed in dollars for the next biennium. I will sustain that, and that'll be a promise made, a promise you can rely on, a promise you can take to the bank and budget on and spend on, and know that no one's going to come and take it away from you in the middle of your fiscal year.
Well, because I can answer the LGA question quickly, let me use part of my time to go back to the health care question. And Pat, I have to say I'm a little surprised that you didn't hold Senator Dayton accountable. He gave 2 answers to the health care question. One was he's going to take the early Medicaid opt-in. I agree. Second answer, he wants single-payer system. It is not politically viable. We don't have what Matt Intenza estimated would be $12 to $15 billion cost when we have a $6 billion shortfall. How can that possibly be an answer to health care reform? It's not an answer. I mean, Democrats have had a large majority in the legislature for the last several years. There has been one vote on single-payer system. It was brought up by a Republican in order to embarrass the Democrats. There's no political groundswell for it. It's not an answer, it's a cop-out. So LGA, I think we need to do a couple of things. I mean, by your own statistics, when a 1% increase in local taxes raises $3.85 per person in Crookston and $41 per person in Wayzata, how can anybody deny that we need some formula, some way for the state to share the cost of essential public services in communities around the state? Of course we need LGA, and of course we need it funded at an adequate level, and that is a commitment that I will make not just to the communities of Minnesota, but to the people of Minnesota. But I think we need to go further than that. I think that we ought to repeal the sales tax paid by local governments is just one of those kinds of silly things that we shouldn't be doing. It is just a bureaucratic waste of time and resources, and we ought to get rid of it. Some of these things are just common sense. We need to make those commitments. We need to do it because it is in the best interest of Minnesota.
Let me go back to that since you brought that up. Senator Dayton, why don't you address the single-payer health care issue, and then I have a follow-up for Mr. Horner.
Well, I recall saying about 3.5 minutes ago that I believe the first step is to have a study and analysis, and let's look at it. And I will support that in the legislative session, and we'll show the people of Minnesota what the cost would be. With all due respect to former Representative Intenza, I don't agree with his numbers. And again, the analysis done by a subsidiary of United Healthcare for the state of Colorado came to exactly the opposite conclusion. So let's just look at the facts. But anybody who thinks that health insurance and health care, the cost of health insurance, the cost of health care, is not one of the driving factors behind lowering the standard of living for Minnesotans and making their lives miserable when they can't afford health care and they can't afford health insurance. And was one newspaper editor in Greater Minnesota said to me his daughter needs an MRI and probably surgery, and he can't afford to pay for it. And the anguish in his heart that I could see as a father to a father who can't afford to provide health care for his daughter, teenage daughter, even though he is covered by nominally health insurance, is something no one in this state or in this country, in this era, with all of our resources, should have to endure. So what's the better answer? I'm all wide open to the possibility. But I've heard from Minnesotans in 110 community meetings all over the state, it's one of the things that's ravaging their lives. And any public official has a responsibility to acknowledge that and start to do whatever they can about it.
Mr. Horner, I want to go back to your answer on freezing public employees. That was tried under the Palentian administration. Do you really feel that that would reduce costs enough, and how would that work get done? Should there be more outsourcing? Should there be fewer services provided? What's the mechanism for making that work?
No, I don't think freezing public employees saves a penny, and that's not what I said. What I did say was I think the new governor ought to put a freeze on public employees so that there is an opportunity to take some time and figure out how we can deliver those services better, to look at a solid evaluation, a thorough evaluation of where we can gain efficiencies, of where these public employees are, what they're doing, and can we do it better. And I think it is that kind of efficiency, that kind of thoughtfulness that we do bring.
But we have had a freeze on public employees.
But
so
Pat, you're missing the point. We had a freeze as a way of reducing the budget, period. I don't think a freeze does reduce spending. What I'm saying is put a freeze in to buy time so that we can do the kind of evaluation that every business goes through to see how we can do it better. We shouldn't be building up employees, as Senator Dayton would do, at a time when we have a $6 billion shortfall and adding more cost. When you're sinking, you can't keep pouring more water into the tub. So just freeze it, buy some time to do the evaluation so we can figure out where we're going. I think that makes all the sense in the world.
Let me go back to property taxes. Since 2003, city property taxes have gone up about 64% statewide. How would your administration's policies affect property taxes in Minnesota? Senator Dayton.
First, Mr. Horner, I wish you'd just take your time to describe your proposals rather than mischaracterizing mine. And I would just say to all of you, you know, that you have reduced the number of local employees in your cities, I bet virtually every one of you. How many have reduced the number of employees in the last 5 to 10 years? So, you know, to say that, you know, governments have not been involved in making these hard decisions is just, you know, not the case. And you talk to teachers who've been laid off all over, you find the same thing. So, you know, a freeze sort of somehow, again, suggests, you know, Minnesota ranks, according to the Census Bureau, the 10th lowest state in the number of state and local government employees per capita among the states. So it's just, you know, it's just one of these myths that's perpetrated that we're, you know, overinflated with the number of public employees. It just simply isn't true. And again, anybody who wants to reduce the number should be prepared to say, you know, who's going to provide those services. You know, there's so many people who run for these offices on the ideology that government does everything badly, and as they're elected, they go out to prove themselves correct. And they defund the programs, or they try to destroy the programs, come back and say, see, you know, we proved our point. We've made government worse, so re-elect us, we'll do it again, you know. I believe in government. I'm proud to have worked in state government, headed 3 different state agencies, unlike anybody else running, one of which was state auditor, auditing local governments, counties, a lot of the cities, pension funds, the like. I know the realities out there. Are there further efficiencies? Absolutely. And we should look for them. And I will search with you to do so, but I'll do so responsibly. Now, property taxes, again, if you don't continue funding for LGA, if you don't continue funding for state aids to education, you force property taxes up. Basic equation. This is not an election. It's not about tax or no tax. It's which tax on whom. And if you reduce or eliminate local government aids, further cut back state aid for K-12 public education, you force property taxes up. You also force 4-day school weeks and overcrowded classrooms and some other bad things as well.
Again, Senator, I don't have any question but that the folks in this audience and across the state have made very difficult decisions, and that Democrats, Republicans, the legislature, the governor have imposed a lot of responsibility on these communities, on these counties, on these elected leaders, and then has turned around and, as you said, beat them over the head. And I think that is unfair. Again, that's not the point. We have a crisis. We have great opportunity. We have a great opportunity to figure out how we redesign government, how we make it work better. But you don't keep marching down the same path when you have a problem. You don't keep adding new costs when you have a problem. We have a crisis. You don't go to single health payer system and say, well, that's the answer. I mean, I agree. Of course that father and daughter ought to have health insurance. Of course. I have solutions. I've proposed them. A study for single-payer system just defers getting that person health care coverage. Look, I ran a business. I understand what it costs to provide benefits for employees. I get it. I've had to sign paychecks. I've had to go out and shop for benefits. I've had to provide health care coverage in times when my employees have suffered from cancer, when their family members have had serious illnesses. I understand what it takes. We need to make those reforms, and we can't have responses, we can't have answers that just simply aren't politically viable while people are suffering. And so on property taxes, that's another one of those answers. I mean, pure and simple, we do need to keep LGA, but look, we also need to stop the unfunded mandates that are imposing costs on you. 40% of the cost of many county property taxes are due to unfunded mandates. We ought to put a sunset on them of no more than 5 years. We ought to evaluate every unfunded mandate. We need to increase the property tax refund by $100 million. These are the kinds of things that are real solutions that are going to get to the kinds of challenges that the people in this audience are dealing with.
How do you propose we close a funding gap that we still have in transportation? There's been stimulus money, there's been an increase in the gasoline tax, we still have about a $50 billion backlog. Is that, should we just lower our expectations on that, or is that something that you intend to address? And please tell us how you would prioritize that funding. Senator Dayton.
Well, you're absolutely right, Pat. That's the MnDOT's projection of unfunded transportation or highway costs. For starters, and again, this is where, if we don't make the investments on an ongoing basis, we pay the price later. If we had maintained the same level of funding for our highway projects that we had in 1990, we would have spent an additional $15 billion. We'd still have a gap, but it would be significantly less. We are behind the 8 ball. When 1981, 82, when I ran for the Senate, I'd leave one town and I could handwrite thank you notes to the next one. Now, a lot of places I'd be lucky if I could keep my pen on the paper. The deterioration of our highways around this state is serious for people. It's serious for the economic vitality. Especially in greater Minnesota, if businesses can't get their goods to markets, their people to and from work, that's a huge impediment to economic growth. And in the metro area, the increase in congestion, the same. We need to do what I believe it's 21 other states have done at this point, which is take some of the federal highway fund, the increase in the federal highway fund, and issue highway construction bonds. They're called Garvey bonds, the federal program. South Carolina has a program called 27 and 7, where they can complete in 7 years projects that would otherwise take 27 years if they paid for them piecemeal. I worked with many of you on Highway 14 and other projects around the state, and that's where, again, piecemeal over 20 years is not the solution. You could complete those using this program in 2 construction seasons. And again, in terms of job creation, that's a huge employer. And it's also one where, again, you have to sustain that commitment. It can't be this year and then not for 5 or 10 more years. It has to be this year and next year and next year and next year. And the next governor needs to provide leadership there. I would set up a highway finance authority and tell us where the experts tell us how to do this, but we have to face it up to it.
Thank you. Mr. Horner?
Well, we do have a $50 billion shortfall between now and 2030 in highway maintenance and construction, but we also have $15 billion that we've identified in the funds that are available. So let's start with $15 billion, because the typical way that we would do it is that we would take the $15 billion, divide it by 201, the number of legislative districts, and everybody gets a little piece, and we hope everybody goes away happy. And we can't do that anymore. We need to start thinking completely differently about this. So my approach, let's start with the outcome. What do we need? We need a highway system, we need a bridge system, we need a transit system that meets the economic development needs of all of Minnesota. What are the systems? What are the roads? What are the bridges that are critical for that economic development system? And there goes the first $15 billion. And all of those systems, all of those roads will not be in the metropolitan area. We will fund in greater Minnesota because there are important economic assets out there. And then we take the next layer of priorities and we say, all right, now we need to find new funding. Might be user fees, might be the gas tax, it might be bonding, might be other things that we haven't thought of, and then we fund those. And then we have to say as a state, we now have another level of roads that just don't have a lot of value, and we're not going to fund it. Because instead of having a lot of roads that are okay or pretty good or passable, we ought to have a system that is really good to serve the economic needs of all of your communities, of all of Minnesota, and no more. And we have to set priorities to do that. So in addition to that, I think we also have some immediate short-term needs, and so I would propose a 2011 bonding bill that would include money for the local bridge improvement program and for 10-ton roads. We need to make sure that we are upgrading our roads to 10-ton roads to get our products to market.
I'd like to ask a quick follow-up question to that. Should another increase in the gas tax be under consideration? And also, Mr. Horner, you seem to identify what you consider shortcomings in the Department of Transportation. Is that, how would you revisit that?
Well, I wouldn't close the door to an increase in the gasoline tax. I mean, again, given the challenges that we have to be open to all funding sources, including user fees, including other kinds of revenue. So we do need to be open to that. But again, you got to start with the priorities. What is it that we absolutely need to fund to make sure that we have a state that is economically healthy, economically competitive, and then you achieve that outcome. And I'm sorry, remind me of the second. Oh, the Department of Transportation.
Yes.
Well, the first answer is that you don't make your lieutenant governor the commissioner of the Department of Transportation. Mulder wouldn't be very good at it, and he's got a lot of other things on his plate. The real answer, and it applies to all of our cabinet in the Horner administration, and that is, you do what Jesse Ventura did, and that is you appoint people because they're the best in the field, because they know what they're doing, because they're smarter than the governor in their area of expertise, and you ask them to work against a clear strategy, a clear sense of principles to do what needs to be done. And you don't have people in there solely because you're paying off this constituency, this ally, this political party, this union, this whatever. You have people in there who are there because they're smart, because they're good, because they have the relationships, and because they know how to get things done.
Senator Dayton on the gas tax, and then on how MnDOT should be changed.
Well, again, we need to redesign how we're spending our highway dollars, state and federal, because we're so far behind now that the increase in the gas tax just doesn't raise those revenues. It's not, what you can get politically is simply not begin to be adequate. So we need to look at this issue of how we can stretch those dollars. If a company needs to make those capital improvements, it issues corporate debt. If a farm wants to acquire land, it usually has to issue debt. So, we need to look at how we can utilize dollars. There's no free lunch with this, obviously. That has to be repaid. But the economic benefits, the social benefits of people being able to get from home to work, to drop their kids off at school or at a doctor's appointment. Again, if businesses being able to get their goods and goods to market, especially in greater Minnesota with the distances, as you well know, just means that we have to make the investments commensurate with the needs to improve our highway system, and again, reverse these years of deterioration. And so I said, well, appoint a highway finance authority and bring some experts in and tell us what we're going to have to do to make up for this $50 billion systematically. It's not going to happen overnight. It won't happen in a decade.
Okay, and just to clarify, yes or no on a gas tax?
So no, at this point, no, because I don't see how those dollars, without utilizing them in a different way, translate into what the need is. In terms of the commissioner, absolutely needs to be a top-notch professional, as would all my agency heads. I want the best people possible. I want them committed to public service. I'm going to send out an executive order on day one to every state employee. Arrogance ends. I want the agencies that are going to be responsive and responsible, that are going to work closely, and many of them do. And many of the regional offices of MnDOT, I've heard, work very constructively and responsibly with you and your planning officials and your local transportation people. That needs to be built upon, and it needs to be consistent statewide.
Both of you have said that you support a bonding bill in the first year of administration. Different governors have had different criteria for bonding in the past. Some have wanted it to be of statewide significance with pretty much a ban on regional projects. Sometimes there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to it. Please explain to us as much as you can what your criteria for bonding would be. And do you believe that it is a way to jumpstart the economy, or should it be based on needs only? Senator Dayton.
Well, we have a state GDP of $280 billion, so $1 billion or $1.2 or $3 billion bonding bill obviously is an incremental effect on that. But you do what you can with what you have available. As I said earlier, the veto of the Governor Plenty exercised. Your own very good paper assessed that left 400,000 work hours unfulfilled and in this year, and men and women sitting on the bench who could and should be working around the state for projects that were ready to go, important projects, public improvement projects, civic centers, MnSCU buildings, as I say, early childhood sites. Why wouldn't we want to take advantage of low interest rates, which your editorial board has also opined, that actually bonding is a fiscally responsible time to be doing that. And so my priority would first of all be for the projects that were vetoed this time. We ought to look at all of them again. I mentioned the stoplight in Thief River Falls. Anybody else has a stoplight or other things that are crucial to economic growth? That's a key priority. These are projects that should put people back to work, but they also need to be public improvement projects, shovel-ready projects, is the vernacular projects that are ready to go, that are really ready to put people to work immediately in the building trades and construction industry, and also going to provide a direct benefit to citizens for those investments. And there needs to be a statewide, a fair distribution statewide, and that's part of the process that the governor engages in with the legislature and others, and projects come in, but it's got to be as fair and equitable across the state.
So just to clarify, statewide significance, not an absolute criteria?
Well, what do you mean by statewide significance?
Well,
It's a
yeah.
good, better civic center in St. Cloud is statewide significance, again, and the multiplier effect of both that's an important regional center, so it certainly has regional significance. It's putting people back to work. I mean, maybe you'll have your next conference next year in that center, and that will add tourism dollars. So, I mean, all of this is a multiplier. But what do you mean by a statewide
No,
significance?
I think that clarifies it.
All right.
Mr. Horner?
Well, I would approach it a little bit differently. I think that we ought to make judgments on the basis of what adds to our economic assets, what allows us to create good, long-term, well-paying jobs, as well as provide some immediate stimulus. So I would look at it in the way of, certainly we need to, again, build out the roads, the local bridge improvement program. I mean, those are economic needs because of the asset, not just because they put people to work, but because they support a strong economy in rural Minnesota, along with the 10-ton roads. But I think we have to go beyond that, and I've proposed that we use bonding to build out in some areas the access to ultra-high-speed broadband. I don't think that we are going to have an economy that can compete in Minnesota with other countries. I don't think we're going to make sure that every Minnesotan has access to world-class health care, world-class education, world-class economic development opportunities until we start thinking of technology as an economic asset that ought to be worth taking on some debt. I would hope that in a lot of areas with the population density that broadband is a private investment. In other areas, it's likely going to be a private-public partnership. And there are some areas of Minnesota where it is going to be a public investment, and we ought to do it, and we ought to make that commitment. I think we also look, again, if we're thinking about building out economic assets, then I do agree that projects like the Science and Engineering Building at St. Cloud State should be funded, because that's what's creating the knowledge, the information, and the leaders that are going to create jobs in the future.
Okay, and now we're going to have to go very quickly because we're running out of time. Senator Dayton, I want to ask you about your tax policy specifically. Your income tax proposal would not make Minnesota the highest tax state in the country, but we'd be up there, and we'd be higher than probably anyone else in the region. What are the assurances you can give people that that is not going to hurt business development in a time when people are really worried about that?
Well, according to the Minnesota Taxpayers Association, we rank 21st in state and local government taxes per $1,000 of personal income, and if you were to add my proposal of $2 billion per year, that would put us to 11th. It would not make us the highest income tax state, and if you were to take the top 10% of wage earners, of income earners in the state, they have a combined total income for the biennium of $160 billion. $4 billion of that is 2.5%. And the point again is, according to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, these are not my statistics. They are now paying a smaller percentage of their income in state and local taxes than everyone else. They're paying about 80%. The richest 1% of the people in Minnesota, who make over $1.2 million a year, are paying 2/3 of a percent of their income compared to everyone else. Now, both of my opponents said they're not going to raise income taxes $1, which is fine in some respects, but on the one hand, it preserves this tax unfairness in Minnesota, and I think that's what Minnesotans want. I think the richest people at least ought to pay the same percent of their income as they do in taxes. And secondly, we have a $6 billion deficit. So if you're not going to make the richest Minnesotans pay their fair share, then what are you going to do in the alternative? And that's what I'm still waiting to hear from my two opponents. So, 2.5% of their total biennial income is what would be addressed here. And as I say, it would restore a fairness where they would pay the same percent of their income in state and local taxes as everyone else. It would return the percent of their income to what existed under Republican Governor Arnie Carlson, the end of his first term in 1994. And again, if you don't agree with that proposal, then you have a responsibility to spell out in dollars and cents where that $4 billion is going to be made up instead. What other taxes are going to be raised? What spending is going to be cut?
Mr. Horner, I want to ask you about your proposal to broaden the sales tax. You've described your opponent's proposal as a job killer. When Governor Ventura's administration proposed broadening the sales tax, it was described as a job killer. Please tell us why you think this is a better way to go, and again, what kind of assurances can you give to people that it's not going to hurt consumer-oriented businesses where hairstylists, barbers, et cetera, customers would have to pay that tax?
Well, and the response to the first point is that public policy always sounds better when it's said without a boa on. Look, I think, again, what Senator Dayton is proposing is not just a tax on success, it is a tax on job creators. When we have small businesses, most small businesses in Minnesota paying taxes at the individual income tax rate, we're now robbing their ability to make investments, to retain some of their earnings and make investments in new jobs, new equipment, new technologies, all of the kinds of investments that grow jobs. So my proposal is, yes, absolutely. I think we ought to lower the rate on the sales tax and broaden the base to include clothing and some personal services. I would not include business-to-business services because, again, that is a job depressant, and we can't afford to do that. Now, we can do it in a way that protects the regressivity, guards against the regressivity of a sales tax, that makes sure that the poor are protected from the impact of a sales tax. And in my proposal, I will have a very specific plan in which we guard against the regressivity. But a sales tax does a couple of things. First of all, it does tax the wealthy. They buy more. They don't have the exclusions, they don't have the loopholes, and they don't have the ability to move out of Minnesota for 6 months and a day to avoid paying it. They pay on everything they buy in Minnesota. Secondly, we do collect more revenue from people coming out of state, and that has some value. But mostly, it's a stable, predictable source of revenue that is fair, that is equitable, that matches the economy as it actually exists today. But you also have to take it in the context of the whole proposal. Unlike Senator Dayton, I'm not just a Johnny One Note on tax. It is not enough just to say, we'll raise this tax, dump all of the money into protecting the status quo of government programs, and everything will be great. I have a comprehensive tax program that goes with comprehensive program redesign and spending reductions to make Minnesota a stronger, smarter, more efficient state.
Mr. Burton, do we have time for a 30-second rebuttal from each of the candidates on the positions?
Sure.
Senator Dayton.
Well, again, I would ask Mr. Horner and Representative Intenzo, why should somebody making $10 million a year, or $1 million a year, or $500,000 a year, not be required to pay $1 more in increased personal income taxes, when the facts are that our tax system now is regressive? That's a basic standard of fairness, and the revenues are necessary. We had progressive taxes back in the 80s and 70s, and we're one of the best states in the nation in terms of employment growth, personal income growth, because employers, job creators recognized that was a shared responsibility, and they got benefits with a better education system. We're not talking about raising taxes
I'm sorry,
for
we
the
only
sake
have
of
30
taxes.
seconds.
We're talking about raising taxes to invest in education, the future of the state.
Thank you, Mr. Horner.
Well, Senator Dayton, if in fact we were just talking about raising taxes on people making $100 million a year or more, we'd have a different conversation, I suspect. But as Speaker Kelleher said, you're taxing the household that has a cop and a teacher, a nurse and a maintenance worker. That's who you're going after. You're not going to get the money from the $100 million. You're getting the money from the average workers. Sales tax, it does go after the wealthy. They buy more, and I'll put in the protections to guard against the regressivity of it. Now we have a stable, predictable source of revenue, whether people live in Minnesota 12 months out of the year or 5 months and 29 days.
And now we need to go to closing statements. Please be patient. I know we've already hit our limit on time, but I don't want to let these gentlemen not be able to make their closing statements. Senator Dayton?
2 minutes?
3 minutes.
Well, Mr. Horner, I'll say the same thing to you I said to Representative Kelleher. It's just not true. My income tax proposal would raise taxes on an individual with a gross income of $152,000 or more, a combined income, joint filers of $173,000 or more. And if you think that's what the average worker in Minnesota makes, you're seriously out of touch with the reality of this state. And the facts are that someone making that amount of money is better off than over 90% of the people in Minnesota. More power to them. I think it's fantastic. But I also think they need to pay their fair share of taxes when we have a $6 billion deficit and kids going to school only 4 days a week in many of your, increasing number of your school districts because we don't have enough money to send them to school for 5 days, and overcrowded classrooms that are leaving children behind. I mean, again, you know, this is about values and priorities as well as about dollars and cents. And you know, years ago, my Uncle Ken, who along with my father built Dayton Hudson with the help of thousands of Minnesotans, well-educated, hardworking, productive citizens, which are essential to every other business success in this state. And we looked at our combined family income one year, about 15 years ago, he's passed on. And, you know, we'd gone up from the year before, and so our taxes had gone up. And one of my cousins complained about higher taxes. My uncle Ken looked at me and I said, we should want to pay more taxes, because it means we're doing better. And if we're doing better, we have a responsibility to pay more taxes. And, you know, I think Minnesotans are really amazingly better than some of their politicians here think they are. I don't believe Minnesotans are going to leave the state. I don't think they're going to destroy jobs. I don't think they're going to take their businesses and the jobs that 10 or 50 or 500 people depend upon and move them somewhere else out of spite because they have to pay their fair share of taxes. You know, President Obama said he would cut taxes for people making less than $250,000 a year and raise it on people making over $250,000 a year, and he won the election in 2008 by more than 2 to 1 among people making over $250,000 a year, because he showed that there was something bigger than that. Now, has he fulfilled that? I don't know. Judgment still remains. But people are bigger than that. They're better than that. They know we have a common stake in the future of Minnesota. They know the education of our kids depends on this. And I still wait for anybody who doesn't want to raise a nickel of taxes on anybody making $500,000, $1 million, or $10 million to provide a budget that's not going to have devastating effects on education and health care for the poor and transportation and public safety, the essential things that the well-being of this state depends upon. Not rhetoric, dollars and cents, facts. I'm waiting for them.
Thank you. Mr. Horner?
Well, as the only person at this table who has had to sign the front of a paycheck, not just the back of a paycheck, I don't have to think about my Uncle Ken. I'll tell you what it does, Senator. For those businesses that need to retain some earnings to invest in new jobs, to pay ahead the insurance premium so that we can provide health care and not wait for some pie-in-the-sky single-payer system that even your own party doesn't support. We need to have an environment, an economic climate in which we're supporting job creation. We need to have comprehensive tax reform. It is not just about punishing success. It is about creating success, creating the opportunities for all of us to succeed. Saying to all of the small businesses in your communities, we want you to have the resources to succeed. We shouldn't be adding to the tax burden of small businesses that are creating jobs. We ought to have comprehensive tax reform that allows an exemption on some of the flow-through for sub-S and LLCs. That's how we're going to create jobs. Give them the resources to buy the new equipment, to invest in the expansion, to hire that new person maybe a little bit ahead of the curve before the income is there. The proposal you're making robs small businesses of those opportunities, and I know because I've had to meet those payrolls. I've created those jobs. I've run that business. I understand what it takes. It's not about Uncle Ken. It's about all of the small businesses out there. That's what we need to be doing. This is an election in which Senator Dayton says if we just add a lot of revenue and expand the status quo, everything will be fine. And Representative Emmer says, oh no, we just need to slice everything to the bone and cut the status quo to nothing. And I'm the candidate up here saying, for a lot of working Minnesotans, a lot of Minnesotans who have been playing by the rules, the status quo isn't working. It's not creating jobs. It's not providing quality education. It's not meeting the needs of our communities. We can't just keep deciding whether the status quo is too small or too large. We need new ideas, new solutions, new approaches, and that does take some courage. We need a tax reform that is comprehensive, that invests in incentives for new businesses, for startups. We need to make sure that we're investing in research at the university and our 2- and 4-year schools, applied and basic research, and then we have a tax environment in which those new technologies, those new ideas can come to market in Minnesota businesses, creating Minnesota jobs. We need to respect the great assets that you have regionally, those economic opportunities. Just increasing the income tax doesn't give you the opportunity to compete for businesses against the metropolitan area. And so that's what I'm offering, is an opportunity for Minnesota to grow as a state, not to divide, but to grow as a state, grow jobs, invest in the future, invest in the economic prosperity of all Minnesotans. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.